Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Room for Everyone. What are some of the steps that maybe a non lived experienced writer could take to make sure that they avoid some of those pitfalls in maybe damaging some of these marginalized communities that they're writing about?
If I can jump in quickly, I would say the very first step would be to read the books from people who belong to those communities so that you learn, you know, some of their experiences. Of course, not a single book is going to be the universal experience from that community, but it will definitely help you to start leading with that empathy I talk about a lot, so that then you have a starting point to do your research and follow through, write your book, get sensitivity readers, ask friends for opinions, and really introspectively consider if it's your story to tell.
Hmm. That's a good question. Is this your story to tell? There's that question of, am I even, do I have the authority to tell this story? You want to like think about that as well. So I think that was a great point. And then alternatively, on the other spectrum, what do you think some of the marginalized authors are facing within the publishing industry when it comes to getting their stories presented?
Is it for me? uh, well, in my opinion, the main issue they're facing is that there's a big push right now from everybody to support diverse books and diverse voices as long as it meets certain people's criteria
Mhm.
of what that diverse topic should be. So, one phenomenon I've seen a lot is POC or BIPOC authors being boxed into the issue book box. It as if our stories are only important if they're talking about our struggles. I want to see BIPOC characters falling in love, making mistakes, being silly, saving the world. And I don't want to just see issue books.
Mhm.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a huge one, because it goes back to, those caricatures that we grew up with that we're so used to. And it's just such a fine line between, like being a publisher, for example, who's like, check out all our diverse titles, but is it earnest, or are you making sure, like, for example, there's a certain Indianness to it to check off a box? Because I think the publishing industry was slow to sort of get on this train. I think streaming series and television is much more ahead, for example, than the publishing industry. And I know it's tempting to put out a few POC titles and say, hey, look, and then pat yourself on the back and think that the work is done. And no, the work is not done. You have to really want to do it, and you have to really want to do the work. And another thing I find sometimes is, like on Twitter or wherever, people just start asking you these questions, that they could Google, or if they really wanted to do the research, and it's not on us to do that emotional labor as well. So I just think it's really important for the people who are in those positions of power to actually really want to make a change, and just to understand that it's not a change that in 6 months it's done. Like, putting out your spring summer list, it's done, we did it. It's going to be an ongoing thing.
Right. Just before I pass this question to everyone else, I'm very curious to know, in terms of like screenwriting versus the publishing world, in your opinion, what is the publishing world missing that the screenwriting world is like really pushing forward when it comes to diverse stories?
I think in particular, what I've seen recently has been with streaming services. So Issa Rae, as an example, has become this power player, and HBO has kind of left her to do that work and create in a space where she wants to create the stories, that are important. Like, there's certain mandates she has about never having stories that are not led by POC. And then I think we all remember Michaela Cole and I May Destroy You, which was incredible. And so that was pitched to Netflix and they wanted to take over, but they were going to give her a lot of money. And she was like, thank you. No, thank you. And then HBO came along and they gave her full creative control. So just like examples like that show that, you know, that there have been advancements. It's not, of course, Hollywood wide, but things like that I have yet to see in publishing. Love to see it someday.
Yeah, definitely agree with you. Sandy, do you have anything to add as well?
Actually, one of the things that I think is really interesting about the kind of the space between, you know, the publishing industry and the streaming entertainment industry is that I feel like the streaming networks are much more willing to take these big risks because they are assessing things from the perspective of the multiple different audiences. I think when it comes to publishing, we have this idea of who reads, and then we stop with a very specific type of audience. And so we want to cater to that very specific audience. And that's one of the reasons I feel like, you know, Wattpad is well positioned because using the data that we have, we're able to identify how broad our audiences are. And so as writers, it gives us the space in which to create with an understanding that, yes, we have people who want to read these types of books, which is something that we already, you know, we all knew as people of color as well, because we know what I know what I like to read, and I don't fit a particular demographic that people would say, oh yeah, she's an avid reader, you know. So one of the things that I'd like to see happening in publishing that, you know, could match what we're seeing in streaming is to kind of take more risks and to understand that there really is an audience out there for this content.
I think even the genres are pigeonholing us a bit. There was a discussion about this on Twitter last week, but it was this idea of like, you know, something like Squid Game, right? Like, I never knew I was the demographic for this super depressing show with all these deaths, but I was addicted to it, right? But I also love rom-coms. And I think in books, sometimes the way it's marketed is like this assumption that only a woman of a certain age will read a rom-com. But it's like I read rom-coms and I read crime thrillers obsessively. And those things, two things couldn't be different. But will both of those things be marketed to me? Probably not. So I think that's something to think about too. Like, you know, maybe we're being too rigid. Maybe we're actually limiting ourselves with these strict genre and marketing strategies.
Yeah, definitely agree. Evelyn, Mariana, do you also have any opinions on this as well? Definitely. So one thing I wanted to talk about, you mentioned, I guess what I want to know is, have you had any obstacles as women of color in the writing space? And if so, what are some of those obstacles?
I want to jump right in here because, you know, not many people know I was actually writing for about 15 years before I switched over to writing on Wattpad for leisure. And I worked primarily as a ghostwriter and as a freelancer. For a very brief duration of time, I did indie publishing. And the thing that I found most interesting is that I got and this is just publishing, I got very different reactions to the exact same types of books based on whether it was under my pen name with the, you know, the image of your classic white writer versus my actual self. And for a good year or so, when I got onto Wattpad, I kind of, you know, so quote unquote, learned my lesson. So I came to Wattpad and I didn't use my own face. I put together a little logo with the LK1 as my original username, which was Lesser Known One. And I didn't bring any emphasis to who I was as a writer. I put the emphasis on, you know, the book I was telling. And even though the book was definitely incredibly diverse, it was still very ambiguous as to who I might be. Because publishing really, you know, when I came into it 15 years ago in particular, I was taught that you have to be a certain type of person to succeed here, you know, and that was a rough lesson. It was fantastic to unlearn it. It was really fun to find my space and to find my readership and to see that, I can put my face out there. I can say, hi, my name is Sandy. I am the person that I am, and still have a readership. Because for many, many years, and this is where I think that the gatekeepers really, in some ways, are harmful. It's not necessarily that I'm stopping you from coming through this gate. I'm stopping you from coming to this gate. I'm stopping you from coming to this gate. And so I think that the thing that is fantastic right now in publishing from my perspective is I'm seeing many, many more people come forward and say, listen, this is just who I am. This is just the type of writing I write. If it's for you, it's for you. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But I'm not going to, repackage myself as someone other than who I am so that my content or my books can be more palatable to you,
Mm-hmm. Definitely more authentic marketing, finding that readership, like finding your audience. That's really important, I think, for all authors, but specifically marginalized authors to hear. What was that process for you in terms of like finding that audience?
It was really easy with Wattpad. And I hate to keep going back and just, hammering that home, but it really was. I posted my content. People liked my content. I started talking about it on social media. People liked what I was talking about. I didn't have to do anything really special. And I think, of course, this is very anecdotal because everyone else's experiences are their own unique experiences. But, just developing a tiny readership. When I put Lead Me Astray up, I was doing read for reads and hanging out in the forums and saying, hey, would you read my book? And all of the fun things that we as Wattpad writers can sometimes do. And all of that was not from a space of, I want this to be a major book that gets published. And it was just from a space of, hey, you guys are writing too, I'm writing too. Let's read each other's books. And I think that really is what bridged that gap. It kind of took me from a space of even thinking about it in terms of, a standard, the so-called the standard that I have to live up to. And it brought it back into a play space. It brought it back into a space of creativity for the sake of creating, So again, this isn't everyone's experience. Some people will come to it in a different way. Some people will come to it sooner. Some people will come to it later. But for me, just shifting my perspective from thinking about writing as something that I have to hit this check mark and my books as something that I have to kind of live up to the standard for, and kind of reframing that as my books are just an extension of my creativity, allowed me to bond with like-minded writers. And that was a really important aspect in terms of allowing me to be my authentic self.
That's amazing and really refreshing to hear, like approaching your writing from a place of creativity and not so much of like, how can I fit into this mold? I think that's awesome. Evelyn, was that your experience as well when writing on Wattpad for the first time?
So before I came to Wattpad, I was definitely pursuing the traditional route, the traditional publishing route. And my experience with the literary agents were actually kind of different. It's one of the things that she actually brought up was that it's a plus that you're a person of color because people are looking for people of color right now. I am looking, and that can be a huge bonus. We can market that. And so that kind of took me off guard a little bit because, like we're on the phone. I wanted to talk about my story and what I wrote. I didn't want to talk about how we can sell me. So it was very different for me. And then coming to Wattpad was kind of freeing. So it's almost like the opposite experience. I didn't have to think about myself anymore. I just came to Wattpad so that people could read my story, and it didn't matter who I was. It just mattered what was happening in the story.
We thrive together.
WritersConnX, November 5th through 6th.